Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groos, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Rabea Berfelde in today's episode. She is a researcher at the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt University of Berlin, and together with Jakob Blumenfeld, she leads the research project Socialization in Theory and Practice, Democratizing Access to Land and Energy. And the project aims to provide a social theoretical analysis of the possibilities and limitations of democratizing resources and infrastructures, and is deeply engaged with historical and contemporary discussions around socialization, a topic that is very relevant for the investigations of future histories in a broader sense, I would say. And there are multiple German episodes of future histories about Vergesellschaftung, socialization, since the German discourse around this topic not only goes way back, but is very much a part of contemporary struggles in Germany, for example, around affordable housing in Berlin. But since socialization is an important concept not only for the struggles in Germany, of course, but worldwide, I'm very happy to have Rabea on the show to talk about the subject in depth in English as well. So now Future Histories expands this discussion in the international realm, so to speak. And if you are interested in learning more about the campaign Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen and Co., which will be mentioned by Rabea a couple of times, then please visit their homepage and you'll find material in many different languages. So you can learn more about Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen and Co. even though you don't speak German. And it is worthwhile, I can tell you that. And this Future Histories episode has been recorded as part of the Rethinking Economic Summer School in Switzerland. It was a really nice live event there, and I want to thank the organizers of the Rethinking Economic Summer School for inviting me. I really enjoyed my time there a lot. The topic of the 2025 summer school was Economics as Resistance, Heterodox Strategies on Housing, Energy and Agriculture Against the Right. I had a wonderful time there, and I want to really give a great shout out to the organizers and recommend everybody who is interested in heterodox economics to maybe join the summer school next year or the year after. Also, links as usual in the show notes. And before we start, I'd like to welcome Regina as a patron of Future Histories, and I'd like to thank Fabian, Lukas, Karl, Valentin and Marie-Therese for their kind donations. And now, please enjoy today's episode of Future Histories with Rabea Berfelde on socialization. Welcome, Rabea.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. It's a great pleasure to have you, Rabea. Rabea, we want to talk about socialization, a term that is quite prevalent in German leftist discourses and circles, but apparently it's not really that well known in the same way internationally. You had a research project in which you tried to develop an understanding of socialization for the 21st century. And maybe let's start with a definition of socialization and also why it is relevant for us today.
Of course. So I'm trying my best in explaining what it means. And I'm sure that it sort of like also resonates with a lot of Anglophone debates, as you will see about economic reform, democratic economic planning, but also commoning, really thinking about common property infrastructures. So socialization is a transformative strategy that revolves around the democratic reappropriation of basic infrastructures. And reappropriation in that sense means the transformation from private to public ownership. And this transformation from private to public ownership really aims at building collective and democratic decision-making power over economic subsectors and also their management for the common good. Thus, the concept also highlights the role of property and private property in structuring society. So it argues that private property really hinders the collective and conscious coordination of economic processes. And because property is also the right to exclude others from using and co-determining a resource. So it blocks the ability to sustainably manage, but also to democratically determine the use of common goods. And this is why the concept as a transformative strategy really aims at democratizing access to basic infrastructures. And as I said, it might not be so familiar to an Anglophone audience, but it sure resonates with different debates. And I hope, we will probably dig a bit deeper into that over the course of the conversation. And
And I mean, at least in Germany, there has been a history of debate around this topic of socialization. What would you say? How do our fights today differ from the historical fights for socialization that we have seen, at least in Germany, for example, in the early 20th century, in Bavaria, other areas as well?
So the prime time for the historical debates on socializations were really after the November Revolution in 1918. And that was more of an open debate within an open historical situation, not a conscious political project, so to say, because it was an open historical situation, as I said, and there was a lot of discussions, debates around socialization as a strategy for economic reform that shifted between more radical versions and more reformist transformation strategies. And just one example for a radical understanding of socialization, for example, Otto Neurath and Karl Korsch, for them, socialization was really equivalent to thinking about democratic economic planning of society at large. And there were other more reformist understanding, for example, of Bauer's understanding of socialization. He differentiated between different economic subsectors. In his pamphlets, for example, he argued that some sectors of the economy are already ripe for socialization because they have a high degree of concentration, very productive, they have character as a key sector, so the infrastructure for other forms of industrial production, such as, for example, the iron and steel industry. And then he also argued that this is to differentiate from other branches of industry, which are more small scale, characterized by medium-sized enterprises, etc., that shouldn't be socialized right away. So that was really a processual understanding of socialization in terms of an economic reform strategy. And I think what is also interesting that he also thought about the socialization of land and therefore, for example, differentiated between agriculture and urban land, so urban land where construction could happen. And he said that should be socialized in order for housing provision, basically to be able to provide housing for the common good, to be able to construct new housing, etc. And in terms of agricultural land, he said that if a farmer uses the land himself, so he termed that labor property, it shouldn't be socialized because it's really the means of production of this individual farmer. So there was really a distinction between economic subsectors, distinction between different forms of land, etc., which is more reformist than the strategies by others like Kautsky, Neurath, Korsch, for them socialization was really equivalent to democratic economic planning at large.
Mm. And why did you say, if I got that right, I'm not sure, but did you say that it was not really a conscious project back then?
Yeah, I think so, maybe. I think because it was really so after the November Revolution, there was the search for how to reform the economy, but there were a lot of different voices. So there wasn't one, and so it wasn't socialization was the one transformative project, but it was just a concept under which a debate happened for economic reform as such, I would say. And maybe in our understanding now, the more radical version of the term is what we associate with it now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then still, I mean, what would it then mean for us today to think about a form of socialization for the 21st century? What would make it into such a conscious project that goes beyond this mere thinking about a variety of strategies that might work or might not work, and be more, I don't know, directive in its approach?
That's a difficult question, honestly, because it has so many layers to it. But I think one thing for sure is that we need to, or it would make sense for me at least, to focus in terms of transformation strategies, to focus on the reproductive sector, so really infrastructures for social reproduction, which was maybe a bit excluded in the historical debates.
I'm not sure if you already mentioned it, but I mean, in general, it's really important to point out that in terms of socialization, it's not just about this transfer of ownership, but that a proper form of socialization, so to speak, would go way beyond that. I mean, for example, socialization is not the same as nationalization, so there's a difference there already. And it would be interesting to hear what else is needed beyond this just mere transfer of ownership in order to come to forms of what you maybe, what I would call desirable socialization, or what you might categorize as a desirable form of socialization.
This differentiation between nationalization and socialization is also a good starting point, because I think, as I said, like socialization starts, or as a transformation strategy, starts from this change in ownership from private to public ownership, but it is really just the starting point and not the end point of transformation. So this transformation process doesn't end with this mere change in ownership structure. And the goal is really a common good orientation and a meeting of basic provisioning. So the argument behind is that a market-based provisioning fails in the delivery of basic social infrastructures such as housing, care, and energy, and that a sort of like common good public ownership provisioning would meet these needs better. But behind this is also the question if we think that social conflicts stop after basic provisioning and basic needs are met. And I don't think so. And that is, for me, the point where really the importance of democratization comes into play. Because it enables us to think about concrete institutional designs that it would allow for democratic and conflictual negotiation of social needs and values. So it's really the aim of the starting point is the transformation in ownership, but it should allow for a democratization of social needs and values of these infrastructures. And this is a very different concept of democratization, of course, which centrally includes economic processes. So it's quite close, I think, to historical thoughts on counter-democratic concepts of democratization. And it comes with a specific form of freedom that results from the ability to like consciously and collectively determine economic processes. And I think Aaron Benanav made a like quite interesting argument in a recent article that's going to be published in the New Left Review, where he speaks about epistemic theories of democracy that he says are based on an additive understanding of value. And he coins this term additive understanding of value to discuss democratic theories that sort of like say in deliberative processes, we just need to include more and more people. And by including more and more people that come with different types of preferences, different types of information, etc., into the democratic decision-making process, we will in the end generate an optimal consensus, an outcome. And I think, and he disagrees with that conception, because he says there will always be like value pluralism and etc. And we really need to account for an understanding of a multi-criteria economy. That's how he terms it. And I think that's very close to my understanding of what a democratization of the economy, at least in theory, could look like. So it's really thinking about what would be institutional designs that allow for democratic negotiation of social needs and values.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, this also means that socialization always has to be thought of as a process of learning, so to
precisely.
speak.
Yeah.
And then it would be interesting to know if the term socialization, I mean, there's already a connection there, no? Because at the end, it's about finding a way of how to organize this relational kind of starting point, so to speak, and find a modus operandi, a form of organization or a mode of organizing our collective reproduction that is able to account for this relation, this social form of connection, so to speak. Yeah. And is there historically a connection between the word socialization and this type of, let's say, processual approach that is very much geared towards a form of social learning through this process as well?
I don't know if it's in the word, but for sure, like also in the historical debate with some authors, there was already an understanding of this like processual understanding of socialization, this like learning process, and also the specific notion of freedom that I just mentioned. So an understanding of freedom that results from determining one's own reproduction process together with others, for oneself and for others. I think that's also, for example, in the socialization writings of Kautsky very prominently, if I remember correctly. And the other thing is that I think it's also one of the more basics insights of like Marxist social theory in a way, that capitalism is already a form of cooperation. It's like highly cooperative in a specific form of sense. But this cooperation is like mediated through private property, and that's the sort of like problem. So that's why to achieve a real sort of like socialization, not one that is blocked through private property, there needs to be the shift to common ownership. I think that's something that sort of like really structures Marxist thinking in one way or another.
And what then are the mechanisms through which this learning can take place? Is there an active engagement within this socialization theory, maybe also the historical part of it, that engages with this question of how a mechanism can be structured in order to account for this, what you called value pluralism, the fact that it's not about getting to a point where everybody agrees on everything, but allowing to kind of still be more or less functional in the face of a plurality of perspectives on a given topic, but still kind of be able to, I don't know, provide the housing, organization of housing and the practical things that have to be accounted for within socialization itself.
Yeah, I'm not so sure if there's really historical models, or I mean, I mentioned like insights on council democracy. That's what comes closest, because there's like this negotiation between more centralized, decentralized levels, etc. But also of how to transport these ideas into the present. I don't think so. But that's probably a question for like future research in terms of like how to think about the institutional designs that would really allow for this form of democratic deliberation. And here I would also say that I think one like more basic insight would probably be that how to democratize housing looks very different from how to democratize the energy sector, how to democratize land, etc. So there's really something to the materiality of the specific sectors that sort of like, guides the possibilities of how they could be democratized. Because with energy, of course, you need a lot more of like technical knowledge and technical expertise. So there's really this question of how to include technical expertise into democratic decision-making processes without saying that it's just to be left to the experts, but also without saying that everybody should deliberate about how energy provision works. That's also not the solution. And that probably looks very different to how to democratize housing, where it's like much more people's everyday life, or what they know and experience in their everyday life really helps in deciding how to manage housing best. So they know the problems in their neighborhood better than some remote like form of housing management.
Yeah. How far is the thinking around questions of socializing energy with regard to that question right now? Because I know there are approaches, DWE and Eignen, for example, as a campaign. How far did they get into these crucial questions around kind of specific institutional architectures, maybe of a then socialized energy grid?
As far as I know, there is no no concept for that yet.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Interesting. But there are concepts, of course, in general, in terms of socialization, and maybe we should provide a very concrete example for our international audience that might not be familiar with Expropriate, Deutsche, Wohnen and Co. enteignen, a very successful and interesting campaign in Germany that is centered around the socialization of housing and that heavily relies on a article in the German Grundgesetz, the German Basic Law. And I would like to quote this Article 15, which says, land, natural resources and means of production may be transferred to common ownership or other forms of common economy for the purpose of socialization by a law regulating the nature and extent of compensation. So this really is in the German Grundgesetz, which is fantastic, I have to say. This is really an awesome lever for this fight around socialization. So maybe could you introduce our international audience to Deutsche Wohnen and Co. enteignen, Expropriate Deutsche Wohnen and Co. and also maybe say a few things about this article in the German Basic Law.
So Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen is a campaign, a Berlin-based campaign that draws on this Article 15 in the Grundgesetz, so German Basic Law, to argue that socialization of housing assets is legally possible. And for the socialization of housing asset is a very particular demand that responds to the problems in the Berlin housing markets. Because financialization of housing is a problem probably globally, or financialization is a process that affects housing markets globally, but it's very locally dependent and very different according to cities, regions, etc. And the context of the housing crisis in Berlin is a very particular one, and the story really begins in the early 90s, so after reunification. Because then a lot of housing privatization took place, which at first included like the former GDR state-owned housing companies that were privatized in the process in the early 90s. And then this process of privatization really aggravated in the early 2000s, where there was a local banking scandal where like a local bank was invested in risky real estate spending, etc., which led to a bailout of the bank, basically. And the city-state was in like debt, a lot of debt at the time. So they had took as part of like the usual story of austerity measures, they decided to privatize public infrastructure. And amongst this privatized public infrastructure were two bigger housing companies that were not only privatized, but bought up by private equity funds that then later placed those housing companies on the stock markets, where they were then bought up by Deutsche Wohnen. So the company's name that's very prominent in the campaign's name. So Deutsche Wohnen is one example of housing companies in Berlin that speculate, that are financialized housing companies, so listed on the stock market, that speculate with housing assets. So it's a very particular story of financialization where there were entire housing companies were privatized and bought up by financial investors. And it's also created a housing market with a lot of like capital concentration. It's really few companies that own a reasonable part of the housing market. So that's really what the campaign like targets, in the sense of the demand is to socialize the assets of all housing companies that own more than 3,000 apartments in the city. So that would be Heimstaden, Deutsche Wohnen, which is now Vonovia, because Vonovia bought Deutsche Wohnen a few years ago, Grand City Properties, Covivio, etc. So around 10 companies. And the proposal is to socialize the asset of these housing companies and to transform the socialized assets to an institution that would then be created, an institution under public law that would rent out housing according to affordability criteria, so common good oriented, and that is also important in the concept, to democratize housing provision, because the proposal also says that housing should not only be rented out according to affordability criteria, but also that it should be managed through the participation of tenants, the city government, and also the wider Berlin civil society should be included in the management of the housing stock. And for that case, so the campaign works with they developed an institutional model that is really linked to council-democratic structures and ideas to account for this involvement of tenants and the government and civil society. Yeah.
And since this Article 15 is not only limited to housing, what kind of potential can we see in this article beyond the question of expropriating housing companies, actually financial companies who own houses, housing units in Berlin? So how far can we go, at least in Germany, with this article?
Yeah, I mean, I think what also needs to be mentioned, that's of course like a bit of a strange article to be in the Constitution, but as you also said, it has a certain beauty to it
Yes,
because
indeed.
it really shows that the Constitution is economically open in the sense of it doesn't say that it needs to be like a market economy, a capitalist market economy. It could also be a socialist economy, etc. And it's in the Constitution due to complex historical reasons, but also because after World War II, there was like a historic consensus that monopolies aren't good, and that because of the involvement of industrial capital and with Nazi Germany, that there need to be means to limit economic power in one form or the other. That's why the article is also in the Constitution as a consensus on that. And I think it's sort of like gave the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Co. an possibility to pursue a very direct transformation path in the sense of a referendum, which happened in September 2021 and was also won. But as I said, it really leaves this economic constitution open. And even under circumstances where there isn't such an article, I think as a transformation strategy, socialization can help orient progressive politics in the sense of like emancipatory politics, because it's really then about a question about like who is the subject of this transformation. And we could, here it was like a civil society organization, a campaign that could draw on this article to pursue a referendum. But we could also think, I mean, it's rather unlikely in the current state of politics, but we could also think about like the state being the subject of socialization. Because, to think about how to democratize key economic infrastructures could be like an obvious task for socialist or progressive parties. And the other thing is that I think what the success of the campaign also showed, that it really makes sense to work on and think about concrete utopian visions of how the economy could look differently, even if it's just particular economic subsectors, which also makes it easier and more imaginable in a way still. Because I think that's part of the like success story, just like being able, having a really radical vision that was also feasible in a way, feasible in the sense that it could also be shown that it's legally possible, that there is a pathway to transformation, that people already thought about the institutional design of housing could be managed differently, and of course also that this connection between housing socialization and the individual problems of tenants on the housing markets could be made. So it was really like, if we socialize housing, that could be beneficial to your living situation, because it means that we could set rents according to like affordable criteria, etc. It means that we could modernize the housing stock, that sort of like management would be in your reach if you have a problem, etc. So it's really like the ability to connect this really grand story with like the problems people face in their everyday lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, this is not the same for different types of socialization. So it's really very direct in the case of housing. Everybody needs to live somewhere. Most people struggle, or many people struggle with housing because it's super expensive, and they can relate to socialization of housing on that front. How about other fields? I mean, we already talked about the socialization of energy provision, at least a bit. You also work on socialization of land. So how do these different fields fare with respect to socialization, both in terms of this effective layer that you just mentioned, because I mean, at some point it becomes a little bit abstract, this connection, and hard to grasp in a very direct way. But also, how does it relate to questions of strategy around these different sectors? Because, I mean, it's quite different for energy because it's a centralized grid. Compared to, I don't know, housing units and stuff like that. So there are these different layers to that as well.
Yeah, so in the research project, we turn to land and energy precisely because they are infrastructural also, and they're also infrastructure for social reproduction, because almost all production and consumption processes really depend on energy provisioning and land. Land is infrastructure for food production, climate mitigation, the really like literal ground for all social processes that happen. So there's no easy connection between the research and strategy, I would say, because what we aim at from the research perspective is really to understand what blocks the transformation of these economic subsectors. So how are these two sector structures? What are the property relations? What is the role of the market? How is it structured? What are the reasons for it? What's the history of the market structure also? And really what hinders the democratization of these subsectors. So we use socialization in that sense more as a framework for, analyzing what blocks transformation and the intersection of economic problems, legal measures, and democratic aspirations and ecological demands. And it's more, it's more just like wanting to understand how these infrastructures could be democratized nevertheless without being able to directly translate that in the form of like transformative strategy. Because I think also we chose this sectors because they're infrastructure and it's really necessary to think about how they could be democratized, but also because they pose like very difficult problems in our thinking about the relation between common property and democratization. Because, for example, when we think about land, like who is to be involved in the decision making over land use conflicts? In terms of like farming, is this just the farmer that like works on the land? Is it the people that depend on food? Do they have the necessary expertise to talk about the processes? What about global dimensions in the whole agricultural sector, etc.? The whole logistical questions around that. So it really poses like difficult questions when we think about like the common ownership, how a common ownership infrastructure of these sectors could look like.
And maybe I got that wrong, but I mean, isn't the effective layer, at least at some point, still a relevant factor? I mean, there are these legal questions that you're looking at, but it begs the question: who's the driver? Who's the driving force, kind of pushing for socialization in these areas? If you say it's probably not the state right now because it's just not a political reality, so to speak, then the question would necessarily pop up at some point how this effective layer could be addressed in a way so that, I don't know, some form of movement power around these questions would be able to provide a resonance within the broader public around topics that might at first seem abstract, but are still nonetheless like a very, very, very concretely infrastructural layer to our lives.
Yeah, but I think like resonating to the wider public is already like a good that's the key question.
Yeah.
And maybe the question here is also, why do these conflicts in these sectors that are already there, why do they not already resonate with the wider public?
Okay, I see.
So why is there not already like a bigger movement around common good land provisioning? Although there's like a lot of like land speculating with agricultural land happening, particularly in East Germany. So there's like a speculation with like something that is so infrastructure to like food production, not only food production, but I mean essentially to food production. Why is there no movement demanding an end to speculation or demanding a democratization of these resources. I think that's also a question. And then I think that links to like research that tries to understand the conflicts in the sector better, because if we understand the conflicts in the sector better, then we are maybe also in one form or another in the future more able to draft narratives that people will understand. So there would be like a question of how to translate that research back into another form of language, so to speak.
Right.
That could maybe in the future generate more movement around this topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's also an ongoing project, so to speak.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But I mean, you already mentioned there is already a form of organization power to a certain degree in these sectors. I know of the Ackersyndikat, for example, as one form that this might take in terms of land, socialization of land. How far developed is the theory around connecting these different struggles? Because you look at socialization in a broader sense and you look at different sectors, but at a certain point, it would be really interesting and important to think about how to connect not only these different fights, but at a later stage also these different modi of enacting the socialization under a broader umbrella of then probably democratic planning in some sense.
Yeah, so I mean, the research just started. So it's a bit
you don't
tricky.
have all the answers already.
No, I'm very sorry about that.
Don't
Maybe
worry.
in 3 years or 3 more years. But I mean, that's one of the questions I want to research in the future precisely, is that do we already have the forms for like a democratic organization of land? And you mentioned the Ackersyndikat, and there are already other forms of like cooperative organization of land that are already in practice. And I mean, it's in terms of like market share, that's like not, they're not as powerful as one would wish. But the interesting question is here, and they like work with around the legal system with like legal strategies to support this like common good organization of agricultural land, etc. And there are like many different forms of how to organize it. And the question then really arises is that already like the organizational form that we need? And is it here more a question of access to land? So is it because the market is in one form or the other already so highly speculative that they can't access more land, so grow in their models, their cooperative business models? Or are the forms for managing land also not ideal yet for, like, so to speak, like a broadening them in terms of like a more comprehensive economic planning? So that's a future research question, I would say.
Yeah. But you did indeed already do some work on the question of how to connect socialization with the broader debate around democratic planning. Maybe you could introduce us to that part of your work. I know for a fact that you wrote a chapter in a book that I co-edited around democratic planning and socialization. So maybe you could introduce us to your thinking around these topics.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe then democratic economic planning also needs like a short introduction, maybe not
Please.
To the listeners of this podcast. But I mean, there's like a debate in like a, I would say also popular debate, but more academic debate on how a democratic economic planning for our times could look like. And this debate really also focuses on like devising concrete models of how a democratically planned economy could look like. And what is interesting, when I started working on this concept of socialization in its more historical meaning, and was reading through the different pamphlets published at the time, etc., as I already mentioned, like a lot of the proposals for them, socialization was the same as democratic economic planning. So with just two different concepts meaning the same, or even socialization was on a conceptual level used as an equivalent to democratic economic planning. I think that mentioned that already. So historically, there was this like clear connection between the two debates. And I think it also really shows that it's sort of like a debate that never ended in a way. It just took different steps. Then there was the socialist calculation debate after the defeat of the Socialization Commission. So the defeat of the historical socialization debate, the question turned more towards like information problems of aggregation, how to aggregate consumption needs, etc. That was the socialist calculation debates. And in many senses, the contemporary democratic economic planning debate is quite similar to the socialist calculation debate because it poses questions around really information problems and the coordination of consumption and production, the aggregation of needs, etc. And there's less. And it's very good in that sense, very detailed, etc. I mean, listeners of the podcast will be very familiar with it. But in very sense, what is missing is, so it's thinking about the end goal of a transformation process. So how would a democratically planned economy, a socialist economic look like as an ideal version? But it leaves out the transformation perspective. So how to get from the here now to this goal. And I think socialization really emphasizes this transformation perspective and brings it to the fore. And then the debate on democratic economic planning is really good in concretizing the goal. But I think also if we think about this, or if we center the transformation perspective, it does something to our goal because we will necessarily have to think it as processual. And if we think about a processual transformation, we might not even know what the end looks like because it will stay processual. It will be different reforms that together might form like a more progressive economy, etc. Otherwise, I can't think like of a way how to get from the here now that we're living in right now to a more progressive economy. I can only think it in terms of like processual shifts. And that will do something to the goal. So like our understanding of democratic economic planning will necessarily change in relation to how we think about transformation. And I think that's a very important insight that we can get from the socialization debate. But nevertheless, as I already mentioned and emphasized, it's really important to work on this like utopian visions, concrete models for how the economy could look otherwise. And the emphasis that the democratic economic planning debate puts on devising these models, this utopian concrete vision, is really important and was I think really important for the debate on economic reform, transformation, etc. as such. Yeah.
And I know of a really nice brochure coming out of the Deutsche Wohnen and Co-enteignen campaign. I actually forgot the name. It's something about the Anstalt öffentlichen Rechts, something. I'm not sure if you know about it. But within the brochure, they detail in quite some length their ideas about how the then socialized housing units will be organized in very concrete terms through a form of council structure. So there you would already have a form of nucleus of a processual understanding of how socialization projects can be maybe connected up to questions of democratic planning that think about the question of democratic planning through council structures. What would you say, how far does the thinking within the campaign go when it comes to making this connection? Because I would fully agree that it's fantastic that the socialization topic brings in this processual nature, this transformation into the debate around democratic planning. But do you know how far they took it in that sense?
I mean, I think it's really a campaign about like the housing crisis in Berlin and thinking about how to build a democratic alternative in terms of housing provision. And it's a very heterogeneous campaign. So, I mean, some people might think differently about it, but as such, it's really like proposes housing socialization as a concrete solution to the problems in the Berlin housing markets. And I think it's more of like, it's more from like the historical debates or thinking more theoretically and even more abstract about socialization that we make these connections between
Interesting. Okay.
Socialization is a transformation process that leads beyond
Right.
the status quo.
Oh, that's super interesting, because I always thought, I imagine it as if there was some working group within Deutsche Wohnen and eignen, or some academics sympathetic to the cause working in, with, and around Deutsche Wohnen and eignen, who were like tirelessly working on how to push these questions further. That was my a hope in my heart, I guess. So this does not exist, Rabea? No?
No, I mean, of course, there's like there are debates on how to broaden the socialization movement, and I mean, you've also been at the 2 socialization campaigns, so there's really a thinking about how to broaden the movement. There's Evi and Co. and eignen, Hamburg and eignen, thinking about like how to democratize and socialize the energy sector or parts of the energy sector. But I think what we also see there is really the need for like more research in terms of understanding how these sectors work and how they could be actually democratized. Yeah. So it's not, but Deutsche Wohnen is a housing campaign.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I can see that. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, quite closely related question then would be, how do you situate this engagement with questions of socialization within a larger ecology of movements, so to speak, or maybe even not only movements, but like the larger ecology of the left, so to speak? Would you say that socialization has the potential to be like a guiding lens, so to speak, or something that people could rally around as a core demand? Maybe a form of collective imaginary that can carry the fight, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's precisely that. It's a collective imaginary, even if we don't have the like recipes for the cookshop of the future yet. As a
in
collective,
3 years, I heard.
In 3 years we have them, and also as a collective imaginary, it already works. I mean, it's thinking concretely about transformation strategies, or trying to think about transformation strategies with all the difficulties that poses, that center around ownership. But that's, as I said, like a task that needs more thinking, that needs more knowledge production around what's actually the problem in certain economic subsectors and how to go beyond that. What can be strategies to like go beyond that. But yeah, it's as a collective imaginary, it's already effective, and I think it's also very good, because I think what it does is an reorientation from really like reactive protest to trying to think about I mean, the title of your book is Creative Construction, to think about how to construct something differently, and to have those proposals for how to construct something differently, and to rally around those proposals, and to be able to make like independent politics with these concrete proposals. And I think it's also not to dismiss that, but there was like I think before, with like the end of the anti-globalization protests, the climate movement, there was a lot of like appellative politics. Is that the word? I don't know.
Yeah. Sure.
So the demanding to any form of also like state institutions a transformation, and to naming sort of like the problems. And it shifted a bit in terms of that to like devising alternatives, which I think is a good direction in being able to think about how to build something differently. Yeah.
And the topic of this year's summer school is also an engagement with anti-fascist economics. How would you say can socialization be a part of this broader effort around constructing a form of anti-fascist economics? Even though I heard in the introduction panel to this summer school that this is still up for debate whether or not the coming imaginary should be centered around this anti, but nonetheless, I would be interested.
And that's interesting. I mean, I sadly missed the panel, so but I think, anti-fascist economics is still like a very fuzzy concept. I don't know.
Right. It is.
And maybe not to dismiss it, but it's like, it's also, maybe it works, it will work also as a collective imaginary, we'll see. But I think what is also behind this concept is like a reasoning that fascist ressentiments really result from economic insecurity. And in a way, I think that's not complex enough. Although there's something to it, it leaves out, for example, racist ressentiments that are also there and that are socially powerful. So I think economic insecurity can't explain authoritarianism as such. But still, and this is really big, but a progressive economic policy is still a very good starting point, maybe the best starting point to organize or to be able or to try to organize left-wing majorities. So something that can counter this trend. So in that sense, I think it's a concept that describes that really well. So we need to devise our own economic policies and focus all our politics on devising these policies because that would be the only way to organize left-wing majorities. So I think, and I still sort of like stick to this idea that for emancipatory change to happen, and I think it can still happen against some people that gave up on this idea, maybe for rational reasons, but gave up on this idea. I think that emancipatory change can still happen, and that for that to happen, there needs to be a positive program for economic transformation.
Absolutely. And this is maybe a question for Rabea the activist. If people are interested in starting a movement around socialization in their country, how can they go about it? You already mentioned that you don't necessarily need an Article 15. So how to do that?
Yeah, I think one learning from the Deutsche Wohnen and Eigenen campaign is also that it built on a really like a movement ecology. So it wasn't just a small group of people that thought, oh, housing socialization would be a good idea. But in the city of Berlin, like the tenant protests, tenant initiatives have a long history of organizing together, of learning for like failed attempts to organize. And I think this learning from like failed attempts to organize and really continue this experimentation with progressive change is really key. And in that sense, I think it's also key to learn from other people, from other like strategies, and also from the failure of other strategies, and to learn from that and then to like transpose that into a positive program. And for that, I think starting a socialization movement would basically mean to talk to people that tried it already. And also, also talk to people that have different transformation strategies, and to learn from that, learn from the failures, etc.
Fantastic. Rabea, there's a last question that I ask, and it is, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
I think I'm generally like a hopeful person. It's a very strange condition in this day and age. But I think what really makes me hopeful is this like spaces of collective learning like these, but also more small scale spaces like in my everyday life. So people that really, despite all odds, stick to the idea that emancipatory change can happen, and then want to learn from each other on how to do it. And I think there's a lot of these spaces, and it's great to be part of it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Rabea, thank you so much. Das war Future Histories für heute. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören. Shownotizen und vieles mehr findet ihr auf www.futurehistories.today. Diskutiert mit auf Twitter unter dem Hashtag Future Histories oder im eigenen Subreddit. Ihr könnt Future Histories nicht nur auf allen großen Podcast-Plattformen hören und abonnieren, sondern auch auf YouTube, wo ihr neben den Episoden dann auch Kurzvideos zu Kernbegriffen einzelner Episoden findet. Schreibt mir gerne unter jan@futurehistories.today. Ich freue mich immer sehr über interessante Rückmeldungen und Hinweise. Wenn ihr Future Histories unterstützen wollt, dann könnt ihr das auf patreon.com/futurehistories oder auch via Spende auf unserer Homepage. Future Histories ist eine Produktion von Metalepsis, zu finden auf metalepsis.net. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Ich freue mich.